The forest is Heimlich, secret. This is one of those words in the German language that simultaneously contains its opposite. The secret is the intimate, the well-protected home, the place of safety. But it is no less the clandestine, and in this sense it approaches the unheimlich, that which is uncanny or eerie. Whenever we stumble across roots like this, we may be sure that the great contradictions sound in them, and the even greater equivalences of life and death, whose solution was the concern of the mysteries. Short excerpt there from passage 21 of Ernst Jünger's 1951 text, The Forest Passage. So said, originally published in 1951 in German as Der Waldgang, and then this is the 2013 edition by Telos Press, The Forest Passage. This is another entry in those books that have been translated by Jünger, of which there are now quite a few, where one feels upon reading it, and this is my fourth or fifth time reading this text, it's just I fancied doing a review of it, that you have this sense that every time you read a new text by Jünger, that his ability as a writer, that his reach and his horizon broadens, often in strange ways, stylistically, thematically, historically, and perceptually. He's always broadening and expanding. You know, we have from 1920 his sort of most well-known novel, I wouldn't call it his magnum opus, many would, Storm of Steel, which is this very a prose work really of a novel regarding his time in World War One. There's then various other War's Inner Experience, Copes 125, Fire and Blood. There's various other war texts. Then we have something like Homageville, which is after The Forest Passage, which is this strange, very liminal, out of time novel regarding the figure of the anarch and the sort of Spenglerian decaying of history. We have The Glass Bees, which is arguably a sort of a science fiction novel of sorts regarding technology. Then you have The Worker, Dominion and Form, which is a non-fiction sort of philosophical piece that feels almost like an extreme Heideggerian text. And so Jünger never wants to be caught, is never caught somewhere as a writer. And it often leads one to wonder what to kind of do with him, whether or not there is some thread that goes through his work that we can hold on to. And I think the notion of holding on to something throughout Jünger's work is possibly wrong-founded. But what I mean by that is probably more something like, is there some force or feeling that can be concurrently felt throughout his work that is there? And I think in The Forest Passage, and I think we can take The Forest Passage and Homageville, and there is, in this Telos Press edition, there is an introduction by Russell Berman, who I previously interviewed about Homageville and the figure of the anarch. But we can take The Forest Passage and Homageville from 1977 as a pair, in a sense, and the figure of the forest rebel in The Forest Passage, which I'll get to, and the figure of the anarch. This is somewhat of a prequel, but I think the two figures are in retrospect now quite a way away from these novels in time, are doing different things. But most certainly there is a progression from the forest rebel, and arguably within Homageville and this retreat to the forest, the possible failure of the forest rebel is seen and admitted to by Jünger in Homageville. However, you know, let's focus on The Forest Passage for now, and I'll bring in sort of a few little extra thoughts on Homageville later. What exactly is this I believe it's a 98-page non-fiction text about? It's really about resistance. It's about what it is for the individual, and Jünger often has this focus on the individual, but not individualism, I wouldn't say that, not modern individualism, but the sort of almost mythical, almost heroic individual. But what is it for the individual to resist and navigate life under modern ideological oppression? You know, when this is being written, this is not only sort of a response to the burgeoning liberal democratic ideals and specifically egalitarianism, Junger's view. But equally, looking back, the dualistic and binary forms of modern ideologies that have arisen that Jünger has sort of burned through in a certain sense, whether it's communism on one hand or Nazism on the other hand, with Jünger himself, just on the borderlines and with connections to assassination plots regarding Hitler. And so Jünger holds this strange place of having little regard, a detachment, which is a key theme throughout much of his work, especially Homage and The Forest Passage, a detachment from all ideologies, from ideology itself, which is a very suspect thing to say in our Žižekian age, one might argue. But he doesn't have regard for these binaries that he's been given. And so instead of stating that outright, he's saying, well, what does resistance, in almost like a Bartleby, in almost a heroic, an inversion of Bartleby Scrivener as a mythological primal being type Scrivener, what does it look like for the individual to have a resistance of that kind? A form of, not retaliation, but an inner felt, borderline spiritual resistance against all this form of ideological exploitation. What does that look like? And arguably, it centers then on a form of what I would name, because the figure of the Anarch and the figure of the Forest Rebel in both of these books are felt. There is an intuitive sense that any form of, if someone said, here is a guide of how to be a Forest Rebel, here is a guide of how to be an Anarch, in the fact of being a guide, in the fact of being a system, these would be implicitly against the things that they purport to describe or guide. And so the Forest Rebel and the Anarch and the Forest Passage itself, this notion of a passage, these are felt, these are qualities, these are intuited ideas that one senses deep somewhere, in some abyss, in some primitive mythological felt sense. But the centering, if there is a centering, because arguably Jünger is a very Heraclitean, processual writer who is fine with flux, and the position of the Forest Rebel and the Anarch is always amidst flux. The centering is on a form of aristocracy. It's on a form of elitism. But arguably, I would say that it's not a form. I think Jünger is far beyond any form of. This sounds completely contradictory, but Jünger is far beyond a form of elitism that is actually seeking to say that they're better than someone. It's a form of aristocracy, and perhaps natural aristocracy and elitism, that is actually open to anyone who has the patience, who has the attention, who has the time, who has the feeling, who has the primitive vulnerability to allow themselves to open to it, to disallow themselves to be sucked into ideological forms that bolster the ego. So the Forest Rebel, in this sense, rejects egalitarianism, but not out of some sort of superiority sense, in some sort of political form of supremacy. Their rejection of egalitarianism is a rejection of quantity, is a rejection of ideological quantities and camps and masses that would equate egalitarianism with the forms that they're within. This rejection then begets and represents a form of aristocracy that is based on a virtue of that felt sense that I mentioned. A sense of aristocracy that has relationships to courage, sacrifice, a quiet heroism, a primal fire, we might say, an elite that is making choices, but they're detached choices. They aren't caught up. They aren't being run emotionally amok by things. And so there's a great contradiction in the sense that if this is an aristocracy, if this is an elitism, which is the words that come closest, it is open to all. And what is the gate would be a great question. I don't think there can be one, because once again, that would be a systematizing, which isn't apt here. But I want to begin and there's not going to be any long excerpts because it is very, it's very short, sharp, and full of wisdom. Very close to a sort of, it's as close as something could get to a manifesto without being one, because there could never be a teleological sort of this is what you should do, because it would defeat the purpose of the forest rebel and transform it into a mass of forest rebels, which is a complete contradiction. But arguably the progression of the book is contemporary man, political voting, through to the forest rebel, then the forest itself, and then through to the numinous, I would say, and myth. So it goes down really from the minutiae through to a broadening of the individual, and then into what that individual is sort of expanded out into. But to begin with the state of contemporary man, the contemporary man who sees himself prevailed upon to fill out a questionnaire is far from any such security. The answers he provides will have far-reaching consequences. His very fate often depends on them. We see people getting into predicaments where they are required to produce documents aimed at their own ruin, and what trifles may not cause ruin today. And then we move through to page 11. It is thus a true form of resistance that we meet here, though one that is still ignorant of its own strength and the manner in which this should be exerted. By making his cross on the dangerous spot, our voter does precisely what his vastly superior opponent expects of him. It is, without doubt, the act of a brave man, but so too an act of one of the countless illiterates in the new questions of power. This is someone who must be helped. And finally, from 32, we might also say that man sleeps in the forest, and the moment he awakens to recognize his own power, order is restored. The higher rhythm present in history as a whole may even be interpreted as man's periodic rediscovery of himself. In all epochs there will be powers that seek to force a mask on him, at times totemic powers, at times magical or technical ones. Rigidity then increases, and with it fear. The arts petrify, dogma becomes absolute. Yet since time immemorial, the spectacle also repeats of man removing the mask, and the happiness that follows is a reflection of the light of freedom. There's a lot in those three. But to begin at the start, Jünger is making this point that I think has been made in a more postmodern sense from contemporaries such as Zizek, but he's making an ideological point about the semblance, the possible semblance of choice amidst voting, amidst the liberal democratic ideals that were burgeoning in the day. This is 1951. And the notion of putting an X or a tick, and the X as a seeming act of defiance which actually begets the very system unto which it seeks to be a detractor or an antagonist. So in that expectation of whoever it is who is the opponent, the very X itself actually bolsters the supposed legitimacy of that which becomes the authority of that which has been voted against. And so in contemporary man's partaking within the whole system itself, in the belief that he is against with his little cross, he is actually sort of doubly so for the very machinations which are the complete betrayal and defeat of his self-worth, his individuality. And he becomes solely subsumed into the dialogue and the communications of the herd. And then Jünger is very optimistic in this book because as we saw in that third little reading, he's saying that man sleeps in the forest. The forest isn't this place in that sense. So the forest passage is one of danger and one of courage, but it's not literal. There isn't a literal forest to go to, which is perhaps the mistake that is made at the end of Omerschwil. The forest is, again, my own understanding, sort of a mythological inner place that is slept in, that can become alive after the masks fall away. So this form of freedom that is found upon awakening from the forest appears in myth and religion, says Jünger, recurring throughout history, likewise giants and titans. The free individual defeats them, and he need not be royalty or a legendary hero. Okay, so this is something that is there. It's this intuitive sense of an age-old historical heroism. This is a transformation that occurs repeatedly when one steps away from the masses. So it's not, again, this is so close to the figure of the anarch, which is not the anarchist. So that distinction is one where the anarchist, this is from Homageville, the anarchist is someone who sees what's going on politically. This is the anarchist, sees what's going on politically and begins to throw Molotovs and begins to not resist, not detach, but to antagonize, and in that sense gets subsumed in much the same way the man who's making the little voting cross gets subsumed as the antagonist there, is subsumed in part of the entire machinations. The forest rebel is in touch with something deeper. The anarch, they're both perceivers. That's key. The anarch, as opposed to the anarchist, sees what's going on and sort of plays his cards. Same with the forest rebel, but in this prior sort of almost prelude to the anarch, the forest rebel, I mean, the notion of the forest brings forth these ideas of nature, some adjacent to almost like, dare I say it, magic and myth. And again, this felt sense of an ancient sort of trembling. The anarch then, it's transformed in the anarch into more of a cunning man, a cunning individual, almost like a Homo anarchus, if you will, like a new form of consciousness, where the forest rebel seems to have these ancient ties. And then when the book begins to unfold and you get a hold of this figure, you can begin to read it in two ways. You can begin to read it almost as a fable, but you can also read it literally as this manual for the forest rebel, a sort of what does resistance even look like? Especially today, I think it's even more relevant today when you move through to the postmodern era, where we're in an era that I've mentioned so much of this recently in recent talks, of cynical reason, where our knowledge of everything makes us believe we're above it. But that very knowledge, as per cynical reason, actually is an entrapment of the very system. Again, much like marking the X on the voting block. And so you believe you're above something, but you're actually in that aboveness, have been completely cynically subsumed into the system. Basically, the question of what does resistance look like within a world that seems and seeks to tell you there is no other option? What does resistance look like there? Symbolically, this resistance and the forest passage, which is one of courage and danger, it's a deep danger that I think has ties to Eros in a certain sense, that the forest rebel undertakes, is a preservation of inner integrity. It's a preservation of something internal. Even when one might, have to feign interest. Okay? They're not uninterested, but they're disinterested, but they're still there. They're still doing what they might have to do. But there is an inner integrity, an inner authenticity that cannot be touched. And where that inner authenticity has its connections to, where that is, we could say is the realm of myth, is the realm of, I don't want to go so far as to say forms, to transform this into something Platonic, but it's just somewhere ancient, somewhere deeper, somewhere enthusing. And it is a venture beyond all conventional paths. And Junger's central argument, really, to quote Jünger, is the forest passage examines individual liberty within the world. Okay, we must account for the challenge, indeed the honor, of maintaining one's individuality in this environment. So the challenge and the honor, what is this environment, the modern environment, basically? Something that grinds down via state power, via the machinations of increasing total technological transformations, via increasing sacrifices and of the individual over to state apparatus. What basically is it? What does resistance even look like in this world that we have come to be in? To move through to the Forest Rebel, and there's going to be quite a few little excerpts for this, begin at page 25. But in our terms, the Forest Rebel is that individual who, isolated and uprooted from his homeland by the great process, sees himself finally delivered up for destruction, This could be the fate of many, indeed of all. Another factor must therefore be added to the definition. This is the forest rebel's determination to resist, and his intention to fight the battle, however hopeless. The forest rebel thus possesses a primal relationship to freedom, which, in the perspective of our times, is expressed in his intention to oppose the automatism and not to draw its ethical conclusion, which is fatalism. From this, we have this primal nature, but equally, much like the anarch, the forest rebel knows his situation. He's well aware and perceptive of his situation. There is a realism to his situation. And it's interesting that Jünger, and I think there is a lot of Spenglerian influence in Jünger, isolated and uprooted from his homeland. This is a distinction that Spengler makes regarding city dwellers. He considers them rootless. And it's interesting that we might have the division between the forest, nature, rural, and the city dweller, the urbanite. And the forest rebel in this sense is a sort of fluxing Heraclitean being. One may never step in the same river twice. Constantly hearing the end of the book actually is that here lies the task of being here and now, and this isn't anything close to sort of Ram Dass be here now. Being here and now, the timeless temporality of the forest rebel. In time, the individuals get caught in temporal processes which become ideologies. The here and now of the forest rebel and the anarch, I would argue, is perception, is an understanding of the situation as it is and taking it as it is. And in their isolation and their rootlessness, which I believe does have connections to being to Spengler in this case, they are nomadic. They're amidst a world of petrified forms, something else we also see in Spengler, petrified, like a rock petrifying, ideologies and institutions and cities. And from them, detaching themselves, both in thought, idea, and quite literally, become the nomadic forest rebel who has to undertake that dangerous forest passage that, from their perception, they know, as per Jünger, is hopeless. But it's from that position, which knows itself, that is perceptive, that true freedom is there. True timeless, inner, integral freedom is found. Moving forward to page 31. This is a longer one. The basic question in this vortex is whether man can be liberated from fear. This is far more important than arming or supplying him with medicines, for power and health are prerogatives of the unafraid. In contrast, the fear besets even those armed to the teeth, indeed them above all. The same may be said for those on whom abundance has been rained. The threat cannot be exercised by weapons or fortunes. These are no more than means. Fear and danger are so closely correlated that it is hardly possible to say which of the two powers generates the other. Since fear is the more important, we must begin there if we are to loosen the knot. And again, to have a destiny or to be classified as a number, this decision is forced upon all of us today, and each of us must face it alone. The individual today is as sovereign as an individual in any other period of history, perhaps even stronger, because as collective powers gain ground, so the individual is separated from the old established associations and must stand for himself alone. He becomes Leviathan's antagonist, indeed his conqueror and his tamer. The individual is in a strange position, basically. The individual, in a certain sense, as per Jünger's comment on being armed, and this notion of fear, because the forest passage, arguably this, to put it in sort of common terms, this existentialist passage of freedom that has an attachment to myth and meaning and a deeper form of political understanding, is one that is rife with fear. And all fear is fear of death, in a certain sense, but what it is. All fear is fear of death. But the difficulty and the unique position of the forest rebel is that from their position, they have no anchors. They have no safe holds. As Jünger clarifies, they are on their way, emphasizes, that they are on their own. They are alone. There is no one to hold to. They are a true individual, a sovereign individual, if one will, an absolute individual. They have no institutions to hold to. They have no states to hold to. They have no ideologies or parties to hold to. They're truly on their own. And the transformation of fear begets the reality of fear, that is death. It's not going to be the party's death. It's not going to be the end of the institution. It is the true death. And in that sense, they become that which has nothing to lose because they are truly free. And in that sense, they become Leviathan's antagonists, because Leviathan, there is a Truns Springer, a leap between the forest rebel and the institution and Leviathan that cannot be broached. There is no induction between them. Leviathan, the point I would make is Leviathan now has nothing to offer them. There is no reward, there is no systematization or purchase of Leviathan that can win over the forest rebel. There is no induction between them. And that is what it is to be a true resistance. So you have nothing to offer me. We no longer speak the same language. You do not understand the inner integral freedom. Even if I am here. This is a point that Jünger stresses time and time again. Jünger clearly was, and he mentions Gurdjieff in this book in one line. Jünger clearly was a conscious man. And he mentions him again in his Paris diaries, by the way. It's the only reason I mention it is because Jünger mentions it to him, and I believe they probably met in Paris. But I believe he's what Gurdjieff would call a conscious man. But the point to be stressed between both thinkers is that you're still in the world, you're still working, you still do what needs to be done. You don't lay down and die. You take and graft and do what you can. It's not some form of hedonism or nihilism. And so you're still there, but there's something mythological and ancient and primal trembling within that is resistance and freedom in itself, eternal, timeless, that is always there. And so the resistance simply is. Moving forward to 37. The ship signifies being in time, the forest supratemporal being. In our nihilistic period, an optical illusion grows whereby the moving appears to increase at the expense of the resting. In truth, all the technical power that we see presently unfolding is but a fleeting shimmer from the treasure chests of being. If a man succeeds in accessing them, even for one immeasurable instant, he will gain new security. The things of time will not only lose their threatening aspect, but appear newly meaningful. And then we move through to 65. In this respect, here and now is the forest rebel's motto. He is the spirit of free and independent action. As we saw, only a small fraction of the mass populace can be counted among this type, and yet these few form a small elite able to resist the automatism on whom the pure use of force must fail. This is the old freedom in the garments of the new times, the substantial, elemental freedom that awakens in healthy populations when the tyrannies of parties or foreign occupiers oppresses the land. It is not a merely protesting or emigrating freedom, but one set on taking up the fight. This distinction has an influence on the realm of faith. The forest rebel cannot permit himself the kind of indifference that, like small state neutrality and fortress confinement for political crimes, characterized the past period. The forest passage leads to difficult decisions. The task of the forest rebel is to stake out vis-a-vis the Leviathan the measures of freedom that are to obtain in future ages. He will not get by this opponent with mere ideas. The resistance of the forest rebel is absolute. He knows no neutrality, no pardon, no fortress confinement. He does not expect the enemy to listen to arguments, let alone act chivalrously. He knows that the death penalty will not be waived for him. The forest rebel comes to learn a new solitude, the kind of solitude that above all the satanically growing malevolence brings with it. Its connection with science and mechanics, though this may not represent a new element, does not introduce new phenomena into history. And so, in that, I think what we find is that which won't be waived. We can read Jünger literally there, definitely. But that which won't be waived, that which won't be understood by Leviathan, is because the reason it won't be waived, the reason this won't be ignored, is because it's not the accepted dissidence. It's not the Molotovs of the anarchists. It's not the X's in the disagreement X in the voting to vote. It's not that I don't agree with the who is in power, or I am voting for the person who isn't the dictator. That is all agreed upon, because those are the very machinations that keep the world as it is running. This is something other, something that can't be understood by that intuitive understanding, again, of that integral cunning man of the inner self. And then to move to the forest itself, this is from 46. The teaching of the forest is as ancient as human history, and even older. Traces can already be found in the venerable old documents that we are only now partly learning to decipher. It constitutes the great theme of fairy tales, of sagas, of the sacred texts and mysteries. If we assign the fairy tale to the Stone Age, myth to the Bronze Age, and history to the Iron Age, we will stumble everywhere across the teaching, assuming our eyes are open to it. We will rediscover it in our own uranium epoch, which we might also call the age of radiation. And then a final one on the forest from 51. The forest passage is, therefore, above all, a passage through death. The path leads to the brink of death itself. Indeed, if necessary, it passes through it. When the line is successfully crossed, the forest as a place of life is revealed in all its preternatural fullness. The superabundance of the world lies before us. One might argue that, and it has been argued, that there is some, at this point in Junger's life, probably the early stirrings of the serious contemplation of Christianity, which he eventually way later down the line converted to with Catholicism, this preternatural finding of Eden, which seems in this sense more imminent to the soul of the individual, a potentiality to be found, but found from the form of resistance against what is. And this movement through death could easily be equated to a movement through hell. The forest passage is a death, in a certain form, a rebirth, which is applied to a catabasis that is reduced in the most positive sense. I mean that in the most, not a reduction, but just simply a folding of catabasis, and a walk through hell, a push through hell, a push through death to die, reduced and folded down to the position of the individual man within modernity, feeling that impotence, feeling that helplessness and hopelessness, and the ability to move through this into the forest, this realm of felt integral resistance, as a form of inner transformation beyond death to something that is timeless. And then there is these allusions to myth and the numinous, especially the ones that stood out to me, and this is from 68. Today too, the cure originates in the numinous, and it is important that man allows himself to be guided by it, at least intuitively. It is the patient and not the doctor who is sovereign, who provides the cure which he dispenses from residences that are out of all harm's reach. He is lost only if he loses access to these sources. In his death throes, a man often resembles someone astray and in search of something. He will find the exit, whether in this world or another. People have been cured whom the doctors had written off, but none who gave themselves up for dead. But the line that stands out to me there, the cure originates in the numinous. Where the cure originates somewhere that is nothing to do with this. It has nothing. The felt sense of what we might call lack or trembling or fear or rage or impotence or inability, none of that can or ever will have a connection to what is, because if it did, we would be able to, there's the cure. It doesn't. The cure originates in the numinous. It originates in myth. It originates in some form of primal fire, if you will. It originates and is found in the forest that is always there and is of access to anyone and everyone. And then finally, from 82, the forest rebel is the concrete individual, and he acts in the concrete world. He has no need of theories or of laws concocted by some party jurist to know what is right. He descends to the very springs of morality where the waters are not yet divided and directed into institutional channels. Matters become simple here, assuming something uncorrupted still lives in him. We already saw that the great experience of the forest is the encounter with one's own self, with one's invulnerable core, with the being that sustains and feeds the individual phenomenon in time. This meeting, which aids so powerfully in both returning to health and banishing fear, is also of highest importance in a moral sense. It conducts us to that strata which underlies all social life and has been common to all since the origins. It leads to the person who forms the foundation beneath the individual level from whom the individuations emanate. At this depth there is not merely community, there is identity. It is this that the symbol of the embrace alludes to. The I recognizes itself in the other, following the age-old wisdom, thou art that. This other may be a lover, it may be a brother, a fellow sufferer, or a defenseless neighbor. By helping in this manner, the I also benefits itself in the eternal, and with this the basic order of the universe is confirmed. This numinous, this myth, revolves around a morality, a felt morality, as long as something hasn't become corrupted, which we would call consciousness. This is a very modern, in modern style, relating to modern themes, but it's a modern guide of Lebensphilosophy that doesn't seek to reduce anything, but only to write about it in the only way it knows how. Jünger is only writing how he knows how. And so myth, and arguably the sacred and the eternal and the timeless, are not treated irreverently in the sense of trying to refine something, but they are somehow treated reverently from a modern language. Jünger accepts that they're there in the same sense that he understands intuitively, deep down, deep within, that his consciousness is speaking to him. In the same sense that the forest rebels' consciousness speaks to them. There is no jurist, there is no system of right or wrong. The forest passage, this sort of seemingly whirling life, speaks for itself. The myths arise and bubble up. And from this, it relates to many other elusive themes that we find in other disparate texts, really, but the closest one would be Gurdjieff's notion of the cunning man, of having to be cunning in the modern world. Of course, the anarch in Omischville. But a position of the true individual who does not, is something there, some real self that untamed, untampered with, is willing to face danger with the knowledge of danger, with the knowledge of hopelessness, for the sake of the beauty and felt sense of that which guides it, is an elusive little book and demands countless rereads. It's the kind of book you could take one paragraph a day and just dwell on it all day. And here's to more Jünger in translation. And I highly recommend picking it up and reading it. And then if you enjoy it, if you enjoyed this talk, I will also link the chat between me and Russell Berman from many years ago now about the Anarch on Omischville, the 77 novel. But if you enjoy this, you enjoy The Forest Passage, also read Omischville, also read The Glass Bees, also read more of Jünger. But for those who are interested in freedom and resistance, and especially in today's times where forms are petrifying, if not breaking down entirely, what to do, what to be as an individual, this is a guidebook of gesture that won't tell you you should go here at this time and do exactly this. I don't think it's a book of praxis or action, but there are gestures towards being, towards the individual, towards truth, towards conscience. Those are my thoughts on Ernst Jünger's 51 book, Der Waldgang, The Forest Passage. Thank you all for listening.